Hello and welcome to this panel on inclusivity in relation to the world of football. My name is Kieran Maguire. I'm from the University of Liverpool, where I do a bit of teaching. And I'm absolutely delighted to have a star-studded panel of experts from the local region. Just to give you my background, I'm actually a Brighton Hove Albion fan. I live in Brighton when I'm not teaching, and I commute to Liverpool, this fantastic city, which has been my teaching home for about the last 35 years. So I'm going to introduce you to the panel one by one. They're going to tell you a little bit about themselves, who they represent, and what their bodies are involved with. So first of all, can I give you Paul Anand, who is the chair of Kop Outs. Over to you, Paul. Paul's on mute.
Thanks very much, Kieran, and really value the fact that the university is taking this opportunity to shine a spotlight on LGBT plus football issues and, you know, the whole dynamics behind some of this. Kop Outs was formed 6 years ago now, and I've been working with the club on LGBT plus issues since 2011. So this isn't something that's just happened in the last few months. And some of the reason why LGBT plus groups such as Kop Outs have formed is to really try and address some of the barriers faced by fans, people employed by football clubs and players and other people involved with the game and their participation in football. So hopefully groups like Kop Outs will make a difference.
Fantastic. And now across to Rishi, who is a representative of Liverpool Football Club, and he will tell you exactly what his role is there.
Thanks, Kieran. So I'm Rishi, Senior Manager for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at LFC. So what that looks like is everything we do internally around embedding ED&I to our people, processes, culture, networks, etc. Probably more relevant to this call is the external focus of that role and how we as Liverpool Football Club take on our responsibility to talk to stand against discrimination, talk to important issues, and even more importantly, is work with our colleagues and key stakeholders, many which are on this call, on all strands of ED&I. So LGBT plus is a really important topic for us, as is what we do around disability, race equality and gender equality too, which all falls under our Red Together programme.
Right. Now, we've got two Joes, so I'm going to deal with the Joes one by one. First of all, I've got Joe Goodall, who is the founder of Liverpool Women's FC Supporters Club. Joe, can you just give us a little bit more about yourself, please, and what you do in terms of the supporters club and the women's team?
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. So I'm Joe. I run the Liverpool Women's Supporters Club. We set up about 2 years ago now, basically just to try and get more people involved in the women's side of the game. I don't think there's any LGBT supporters clubs for the women's side specifically, but it's nice that we've kind of tied in with Paul and Kop Outs to be able to, you know, link that across the game full stop. And yeah, our aim really is just to get more bums on seats within the women's game. And, you know, we're a very inclusive group. Being part of the LGBT plus community myself, it's a no-brainer to do that within our group.
Absolutely. And now to our next Joe, Joe Block from the Spirit of Shankly. Joe, how are you involved with this?
Yeah, thanks, Kieran, and hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm Joe Block. I'm the chair of Spirit of Shankly, which is the Liverpool Supporters Union, but also the Supporters Trust for Liverpool FC. And that really sort of strands two things. One is obviously to hold the club to account for the things that they do, both on and off the pitch. But the second thing we do is also to really ensure that we have the voice of the community and the voice of our supporters, really. So most importantly, we've got, you know, some of the region about 37 to 40,000 followers. We try to represent everybody, but, you know, the reality is we don't. So that's why we work incredibly closely with Joe, with Paul, with Ted and others, really, to try and ensure that we get a reflective view for all Liverpool fans across the world.
Thanks, Joe. And that you mentioned Ted. Ted, you're next. You are chair of Liverpool Disabled Supporters Association. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your role?
Yeah, thank you, Kieran. I'm vice chair of Liverpool Disabled Supporters Association and also vice chair of the Premier League Disability Advisory Group. We're proud to support Paul and everything he does at Kop Outs, and along with Joe at SOS, Joe at LFC Women, and a couple of other groups, because we believe unity is strength. What we do is we're basically the conduit between our disabled supporters and Liverpool Football Club. Just making sure that everything at Anfield is right access, looking after all needs of our disabled supporters. And, you know, we're proud to be in partnership with the club and with our supporters groups.
That's great. And I think you used a really good word there in terms of partnership. Absolutely right. And last, but of course, not least, it's Paul Williams from Merseyside Marauders. Can you give us the background, please, Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Mersey Marauders was founded in 2005. I've been there about 10 years now. So we're the Merseyside team that provide inclusive football. We play in the Gay Football Supporters Network and other competitions. I myself also sit on the Inclusion Advisory Group at Liverpool County FA, and I've been a season ticket at Liverpool for over 20 years now.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, it's sort of to open up the debate. It's 2022, and there's still there are still concerns. So, from your perspective, is it important to have players or managers who come out, or is that not an issue? Can I start off with you, Paul?
So players or managers coming out would be amazing. But actually what's more important is to create the environment that they will be comfortable to be out in. And that environment isn't just about their fellow players and the managers. It's about the club owners, clubs as employers. It's about the agents. It's about journalists. And yes, it's about fans. And all of those people and the sponsors as well can play a really good role of being allies. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, at Kop Outs, we're so proud of the support we've received and the solidarity shown by the organisations represented on this call today and many others who now very much stand up and be counted. So, yep, it's fantastic that we get allyship being shown by Jurgen Klopp, by Jordan Henderson and many others. And yes, it will be great to have more out players when that comes about, but it's not the be all and end all. The best thing to change is the environment.
Yeah, attitudes are absolutely critical. Anybody else like to comment on that?
I think, Kieran, I suppose we want to be in a situation where Paul says that it really isn't an issue and that sexuality isn't a relevant point. But when you've got no examples of it, when you've not had the first one, it always will be a point. Hopefully we'd like to get into place after that first one happens, that then it becomes a moot point. But that's difficult for that first person who it would be. And I'm sure we'll come across that in the discussion as we go on.
Yeah, I mean, and I've seen some of the comments coming out from the likes of FIFPro, which have disappointed me as a football fan, that perhaps some of the institutions within football themselves don't appear to be as progressive as they should be. That is a disappointment, and that sort of leads me to the next question as such. Do you think that football as an industry is institutionally homophobic? Maybe like to contribute there.
Yeah, I can.
Hi, Ted.
I think football is pretty reflective of society, and I really do. And I just think this is why, following on from your last question, why we won't see people putting their head above the parapet, irrespective of sexuality, gender, or disability. In the same token, you don't see a disabled football manager. You know, it just doesn't happen. And I do think it's reflective of the sad way society is in, and to change this and to change how homophobic football is, you need to change society, which we need to do through education, because it's just so sad. It's, as you say, 2022. The fact that we're having this discussion is just so wrong.
I think you're absolutely right. that change to society can come using football as a bridgehead in my view, because football does play such an important part in our lives. We've got a World Cup taking place in Qatar in 10 months' time. I've been to many World Cups. I'm not going to Qatar. It's just because by doing so you're endorsing something which you don't believe in. So Rishi, you work in the football industry. In your experience, do you think that there are still attitudes which are institutionally homophobic? Not at Liverpool Football Club, but you've worked with other clubs as well in coming into contact with them and the football institutions. And we saw what happened at the Football Association chair had to resign over comments which I just found staggering as a fan.
To be honest, Kieran, 100%. You're totally right, but I think Ted's point is a really valid one. For me, football is a reflection of wider society. So the work that we do around online abuse and discrimination, the work that we do with Kop Outs around challenging specific chanting issues, or when we have certain opposition, we know that unfortunately there's going to be potentially an increase in homophobic or discriminatory abuse. And unfortunately, we're not just seeing that in the terraces, we're seeing it on social media, we're seeing it in the streets. So you could say, yes, there is an issue for football, but you could also say that issue is no different to what we see in society. I think the reason why we're having this call today is the reason why it's a football panel is because football is national sport, and therefore people will always put focus on it and will always potentially point the finger towards football, as football needs to be the institute that changes things, where actually you could argue that it's wider society. We saw that when we entered the first lockdown and players were being asked to take huge pay cuts and do stuff like this. But actually, is that the solution? It's a little bit off topic, but you look at the leaders that we have in Liverpool Football Club, the way that Jurgen speaks, the way that Jordan Henderson speaks as club captain, the way that we've got Billy, who's our CEO, who attends every single Pride event every year that he possibly can. It's incredible, really. So for me, football is doing amazing stuff. But I'll always caveat that with, we can always do more, because why would we want to?
And Joe Goodall, if I can just bring you in here, we've been talking about the men's game, but in the women's game, the attitudes there appear, again, from the outside, to be the polar opposite. There is such a spirit of inclusion. And do you think the women's game can show the men's game the way forwards?
Yeah, I've just seen a question from Tracy there about the same thing as well, saying that is it the complete opposite within the women's game? I wouldn't say it's the complete opposite. I think there's still issues within the women's game to do with homophobia, transphobia. But I think on the forefront, it does a lot better than the men's game at the moment. I think there's a lot more inclusivity within the women's game and within, the supporters, the fans, whether that's because it's a more family orientated game. There's a lot more families and younger children that go to the women's game than there is to the men's. And I think, having a lot of female players within the LGBT community that are open and, publicly on social media, they're not pushing it in your face, they're not forcing it on anyone, they're just being themselves. And I think, yeah, men's players could probably learn from that, and it'd be, as Paul said earlier, it'd be great if we did have some of the men coming out and just trying to be themselves. And I think within the men's game, they would probably get a lot more support than what we think. But it is just who's going to be that first person to take that step and plunge into the deep end and see how it goes.
And perhaps also talk to one of the two Pauls here. As fans, do you experience homophobia on a regular basis at matches, either on an aggressive or even on a passive level, in terms of what you have to experience with being lovers of the game?
I think my experience recently at Liverpool has been largely free from any personalised, directed homophobia at me as an individual or any out people who are at the match. that notwithstanding, we've also seen instances of chanting against Chelsea associated players and Chelsea, which is homophobic, that the CPS has now recognised as a hate crime, in fact, and that chant has, that ended up being a subject of the interview with Jurgen Klopp, etc. What's been brilliant is actually more and more fans from the mainstream are taking responsibility, tapping abusive people on the shoulder and saying, don't do that here. And I'd much rather see our great fans continue to show their solidarity and continue to make improvements to the game themselves, rather than have to resort to stewarding and policing measures that very often, unfortunately, can be counterproductive. But it's when our own fans take responsibility, as they are doing, that really the game becomes a much more enjoyable experience. Paul, I don't know if you've got any further to add. You go to the game quite often as well.
Yeah, echoing what you say, really about what's the positive side of things is that those chants are being questioned now. And that's a positive thing. I remember being in a pub many, many years back, and there was a chant, and it was typical football chant, and it was, can't remember how it went, and it was something, and David Moyes is gay. And that was how the chant ended. Do you know what I mean? It was the full chant. And as a fan in that pub, when you go to a football match and football is all about feeling part of something, I didn't feel part of that, because what you're being told there is that's wrong, so you're wrong, you shouldn't be here. That's not a football thing. That's, as Rishi was saying, that's a society thing, okay? So we've had incidences recently where we've had the Feed the Scousers chant, okay? That is the same kind of thing. It's like, unless you're on the receiving end of that chant, you don't see why that matters, okay? So although that is still there, so we take the example of the chant about Chelsea, okay, what's good now is that we're starting to question that, and that we're bringing that up, and we're saying, no, that's not okay. And the more that you do that, the more like fans that myself will feel more comfortable in saying to somebody in that pub situation, hang on a minute, that chant isn't on. Yeah. Even the manager of our football club says that chant isn't on. So I think like leading from the top, it really does change things.
Brilliant, brilliant. And Ted, if I can just sort of broaden this from your perspective as representative of the disabled supporters, do you think that the attitude of football clubs is welcoming, or do you think, again, you're having to fight the system all the time to allow fans who are disabled to just they love the club as much as everybody else? This idea that there's not appropriate places for fans to go, it must be a real challenge to you all the time.
I can. It's definitely a real challenge, but we're quite fortunate at Liverpool Football Club because they're so supportive of us, as they are with many minority groups. It's fair to say and true to say that this is not reflected in other Premier League football clubs. I can not only really talk about Liverpool Football Club and the support they give to disabled supporters, especially through what they do with Red Together. Because it's so important that whether you're part of Paul's group, you're part of our group, you support Liverpool women. Football is all about inclusion and being part of something. And we're all part of Liverpool Football Club, no matter what group we're from. And I think we are really fortunate at Liverpool because words can be cheap, but, these aren't cheap words. It's true. It's really, Liverpool are reflective of the old fan group. From disabled to non-disabled, everyone is included at Liverpool Football Club. But when you're a minority group, you're out there, and you're different to the rest in terms of us, in terms of our disability, and and we're conscious of that. We do rely on the football club to make us inclusive, and I think a lot of it's down to education. Liverpool put a lot out there about disability. They've recently you know, helped us with a situation we got at Wembley. So we feel really part of it. And that's what's important to us. And that's why, you know, we do stand shoulder to shoulder with Paul. Anything, you know, to do with homophobia, it's just simply not acceptable. And I think we're pretty good, you know, at Anfield, you know, in terms of this. And through education, we can hopefully totally eliminate it. Great. And Joe, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I mean, so just listening to this, I mean, it's so powerful, isn't it? That what's happening kind of in this moment, but you know, you worry that it's not the start. It's actually we should be further along the road, and I think that's part of the problem, isn't it? But I think what kind of impresses me more than anything else about the way that colleagues around this room do it is about providing leadership, but also confidence. So if I can use sort of Spirit of Shankly's example, really, you know, clearly we want to support every single Liverpool fan across the whole wide world, and try to be reflective of that. But we wouldn't be so, you know, sort of, I don't know, bullish about it to suggest that we are, and we're not. And we work very closely with, as we've said, with Paul, with Ted, with Joe and others to educate ourselves. So that educate bit then gives the confidence to do something different. And I think Paul could probably always rely on SOS to give him backing. It's not about that though, is it? Because it should be a natural thing. It shouldn't be kind of requesting it and saying, "Can I have your support, please, Joe?" Well, it should be intrinsic. And I think that's why when we had our AGM in November last year, you know, we deliberately took a couple of inclusion motions to the conference, really. And we got 99.4% support for our inclusion responses for our motions. That gives us a platform then to take that leadership stance for the whole of our football fans. So it's not about an issue base now. So it's not standing up to the Chelsea chant or whatever else it is on individual cases. Yet we'll always do that. We'll always champion a cause. But we need to actually do something that's intrinsic and actually is a legacy of all of this. And I think that's what's really important for me and from Spirit of Shankly to not just use the platforms to single out one individual aspect of it all, but to actually make a difference for the future. Because if now is the start, then I want my children, my grandchildren to think, I wonder why they had that meeting in 2022, because it's great. You know, and I think that's the bit, you know, that for me is about what can I do, what can SOS do to ensure that there is a change from now on, that actually everybody does feel comfortable going to the game, whether they're playing, whether they're working or whether they're watching.
Brilliant. Just sort of returning to the former issue, we do have this sort of homogenized football player viewpoint taken by the media and fans, and ultimately, you know, we've already discussed somebody's sexuality is their sexuality. You know, what's mine is different to somebody else's, and acceptance should be the way forwards. But do you think? And I was involved in a Channel 4 documentary recently about, you know, what would happen if a player came out, and it was interesting to see the people within the industry themselves talking about that. Do you think the conditions are there at present, both within football, but perhaps my main concern would be from the media, because for the first player to come out will be known as such and such, the gay footballer. And yeah, not a left back. No, and that I'm concerned about things from a label's point of view. Do you think we have the present conditions within society, because it is a societal issue, for a player to come out? And if so, what type of support do you think they would get from the different stakeholders, the club, the changing room, and the fans? How about Rishi, you know, from Liverpool's point of view?
So it's a great question. I think from a club and a wider football perspective, the support is there, would definitely be there. And I also think it's important to recognise that, I don't know, Joe Goodall's mentioned it earlier, but in the women's game, we have a number of openly gay and LGBT plus players who are, and it's not an issue there. So perhaps there's lessons to learn from the women's side of the game, and to understand, okay, how are they in that position? What can we learn? What can we take over into the men's side? And what's best practice look like from a club perspective, from a wider football perspective? There are huge systems in place that the FA have talked about at men, the PFA, as a club, with all our processes around when a player does decide to make that choice about sharing their sexual orientation with the world, they'll be fully supported. And it's obvious that that's the case. I think the media one and the fan perspective, I'm going to leave that to colleagues on the call, to be honest, because I'm really intrigued to sort of see what they think around that. But I think me speaking on behalf of the club, the support will always be there for anyone, and regardless. And actually, I think we need to remember that women's game has made brilliant strides in this, so much so we talk about it never being an issue in the men's game. It's not really an issue in the women's game, so there's definitely something for us to learn there.
Absolutely.
I Kieran. You know, yesterday we were talking about Justin Fashanu, the anniversary of, I don't know, his birthday or his passing. And he came out many, many years ago. You know, and it's just so sad, isn't it, that we're still having this discussion now and why it is such a big issue. And I think if somebody does come out, they're probably scared to do it because the probably level of online abuse that they will suffer, which will affect the family. But, you know, I think now is the time for somebody to just put their head above the parapet. And I think they'll be surprised by the level of support that they will get. Because, you know, I know everybody in our group, people I know in the other groups that we partnership with, from our relationship with Paul, we will be the majority, you know, and we will speak as a majority and hopefully speak louder than the minority and drown their, you know, horrible voices out and let everybody be who they are in the way that they choose to be. And let's just give them our, you know, full, total and unwavering support as a society.
Yeah. And all can say from a personal level, Justin Fashanu used to play for Brighton, and he used to come along and coach my football team. And Justin Fashanu was just a great guy. And he was a great guy because he was Justin Fashanu, and his sexuality was not an issue. And that's the most important thing. And that's one of the biggest frustrations. But given what happened to him, I can certainly see the issues that a player might be reluctant about. I think it's absolutely great that you mentioned, Ted, that you know, drowning out the dissenting voices, because we have seen progress with regards to players taking the knee. You know, the proportion of people who are, for whatever ludicrous reasons they've got, who were doing it, that has disappeared, with the exception of one or two clubs, and we know who those clubs are. So I think the same thing that could be achieved by a player coming out would be there. What would your attitudes be, Paul, for example, with regards to this?
I think a player coming out will attract some dinosaur views, undoubtedly, from some fans. But overall, I think it's really important to recognise that the majority of fans want to judge a player on their skills and ability, and that's the primary thing that should be the issue. And controversially, in a way, I think if the next player that comes out in UK football is media friendly and media savvy, they will probably mop up more sponsorship deals and more media support than any other player, because they'll have that unique selling point in terms of marketing and so on. How fans react will very much depend on the fan base and what their tribal nature can be at times, sadly. There are some fan bases which we know have got a long way to go. Liverpool's fan base, as Ted and Joe and myself and others have explained, is generally very progressive. But it's not all of us yet. There are still some fans who are stuck in the past. But the vast majority of fans are now not only not stuck in the past, they're prepared to stand up and be counted and tap the idiots on the shoulder and say, leave it out, or to drown them out with positive chanting songs. And we've got a fantastic songbook of amazing songs and stuff at Anfield, as you're aware. You're a Brighton fan.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Last times you've attended Liverpool and Brighton matches, have you observed some of the bad chanting that sometimes is directed at Brighton from Liverpool fans? And is it comparable in volume if it's happening to what's happening elsewhere?
I would say from Liverpool fans, no. The chants tend to come when you're beating the team. Now that's not an issue for Brighton against Liverpool. Let's be honest. So it's never really been a challenge. But should we say that if we go the other side of the Pennines, it's much more of an issue? And actually, here I'd like to put this out to the panel for guidance for myself. What we've tried to do as a Brighton fan base is that we've tried to reclaim those attitudes against us. So when fans do make those chants, we sing back, "You're too ugly to be gay," and that's our standard approach. And they don't know how to react to that. And you know, if I'm going to a match and I'll be walking up the ground, I'm proud to wear my blue and white colours. As every fan should be able to go to a match, home or away, and wear their colours. But I will get the homophobic chants from blokes in pubs and so on, and you just try to engage with people, and as soon as you do start to engage with them, the barriers will start to slowly come down. You can't deal with some entrenched attitudes. And then you realise actually we've actually got 3 players who have signed in common, and you get talking about that, and then once you do talk, I think that's the way forwards. But it is still an issue when, and let's be honest, when it's groups of men, normally young men, get together, they feel that they have to sing these songs, and some of the chants that Brighton fans sing embarrass me with regards to other players at other clubs and so on. But it's an ongoing challenge. But education and engagement, I think, are ways forwards here.
Kieran, picking up on the point that you said there about the engagement, I think that's the key thing, because when fan base is making a chant and it's generally seen as abusive towards a denomination, when they're making that chant, obviously they're not always thinking about the connotations of that. I don't think it's thought through. Like the Brighton chant, for example, I don't think that it's thought through. I think that they think it's just banter. Do you know what I mean? And we know it's not, but it needs that explaining and that challenge that comes into it, really. And as you say, it's often groups of young men. And going back to the point that Ted made about the fact that it's 2022 and we're still having this conversation, we've almost created this powder keg for a footballer that if they come out, they basically have to be a celebrity for this to work. Do you know what I mean? And they might be a young man who is plying the trade and they are interested in the football and that's what they want to do. So that's why I know that we've not had it in the Premier League, but in other leagues, for example, people might come out at the end of their career more likely than they will during it. So it will take a certain type of player who wants to actively challenge that and engage with that. So you are asking a lot. I think the support will be there, but I think we have to recognise that we are asking a lot. All that we can do and clubs can do is say that we'll be there to support and help, but it is a big challenge for someone.
And Joe Goodall, I was about to bring you in here. In terms of the women's game, how are those attitudes still there on the terraces, or in your view within clubs, or has the women's game broken through there?
Definitely not as much within the women's game. I've never personally seen any attacks within the women's game for, on LGBT terms. I was just about to bring up actually the video that Jurgen Klopp did with Michaela Moore. Things like that the clubs do, I think are a huge turning point for the game. It shows that the men's, whether it's the players, the managers, the staff, are inclusive and they're allies of what is going on within the game. And that kind of ties over to taking it into the men's game more than it just being relevant in the women's game. So I think clubs can certainly do a lot more on that front. It was nice to see Jürgen had the rainbow laces on at the games as well. And I've just wanted to pick up on Nick's question about the non-binary players. Don't know a whole lot about it, but I just wanted to point out that there is actually a player called Quinn, who they're a Canadian player, play for the women's national team for Canada. So that was just something to show that there is actually representation there for non-binary people within the football community. I just wanted to throw that out there too.
Absolutely. And Joe and Ted, I think you want to contribute to this one as well.
Yeah, I think Ted was before me, actually. Kieran, so jump in, Ted.
Yeah, an important point's being raised there about chants. And we recently had an issue with Chelsea. Obviously, I'm not going to say what chance it is, but there was a discussion to be had over social media, and some of our younger supporters genuinely didn't know what that chant was referring to. And it's only through education. And there's other similar songs where they're from generations ago, the terminology being used. And some of these kids genuinely don't know. We need to educate them and explain to them why this is wrong, how this is so hurtful to people. Education is the key here. We can't bury our head in the sand, and we can't automatically assume that everybody knows this song they're singing is referring to a specific thing. Oh, it's just something that my dad sang, which he shouldn't have sang in the first place, and it's something that his dad sang before them. If they're not getting the input from the family that why that chant is wrong, we need to educate them through all of our groups, through all of our football clubs, through all of our social media accounts, to tell them exactly why that chant is wrong and why it shouldn't play no part in a football ground or a pub or anywhere else.
I'm with you entirely. And I think this is where football clubs themselves have got a really powerful voice, because if you hear that from a teacher, if you hear that from a social worker, if you hear that from a policeman, and you're a young person, your attitude might be not necessarily positive because you see them as part of the establishment. When it's coming from a coach at a football club, when it's coming from Jurgen Klopp, when it's coming from Jordan Henderson, fans' ears prick up and they go, okay, these guys represent my club. I want to share in that representation. And I do think the clubs themselves here, and they are doing a fantastic job in it, and certainly, Rishi, what you're doing at Liverpool as an outsider is amazing. Is generates a far more positive return on investment. And this is me coming across as an accounting teacher here. I had to go and squeeze that in somehow over the course of the talk. So I think you're absolutely right. Joe Block, just over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Paul Amann mentioned earlier before about about owners of football clubs as well. I think one of the great things that we've got at Liverpool now is that there is a common value base between fans and the club, and that gives strength really, because I know when we did have the chant that was called out and we had the video with Paul and Jürgen, actually it did cause a real division amongst fans, being honest. Not every Liverpool fan said it was great. And actually, a lot of Liverpool fans were calling us out and saying that we should actually be defending Liverpool and saying they should be able to sing what they want. Liverpool fans should be able to sing what they want, about what they want, when they want. And, that's not the case, because that's where I was saying before about the education and about the confidence is what that's led to now, is that there's a confidence of, fans and the club working together on supporting values. So a very, very quick example, when again, somebody mentioned about the poverty chants about Liverpool. Leicester thought it was great fun over the 2 games recently to sing about poverty in Liverpool, when we all know that it's a national scandal where poverty is at the moment. Working alongside the club, working alongside Leicester, working alongside Leicester fans, we actually worked through a programme of educating Leicester City fans really. They came to the food bank before the game last time, donated food, and the chant wasn't used whatsoever. So that collective voice of fan and football club together can be hugely powerful. But I suppose part of me thinking is about how close are other fan bases to their football clubs, and do their football clubs have the same values as the fan bases? And maybe that, again, that's something that we perhaps need to work on. Maybe that's a Football Supporters Association alongside the Premier League, alongside the FA, and alongside others to try and work that through, to make sure that supporters trusts are aligned with club values and vice versa.
I agree entirely, and I can't say too much here, but I'm currently working with DCMS with regards to the aim of getting into the Queen's speech, some of the proposals from the Tracy Crouch report, and one of the key issues there, and regardless of party politics, I think the report is very progressive. The idea of greater representation and for clubs to acknowledge the importance of fans and how the two parties can work together, and everybody wins if you work together. Just sort of we touched gently upon the World Cup in one of the earlier conversations. Tom Daley recently said that the international tournaments such as the Olympics should not take place in those countries which don't support LGBT rights. What are your views? I mean, I used to teach in Russia, and the attitudes there were, if we think we've got dinosaurs in this country, it's the pre-dinosaur era taking place in Russia, which is really disturbing, and that has been politicized as well with the leadership that they have there. So what would your views be? Can I first of all perhaps put this to Paul Williams?
Yeah, I don't buy the argument that what you can do is go over there and re-educate people. I don't buy it. I think that that's just an excuse that people give to kind of say, well, we're going to do it anyway, basically, because the reason why it's there is clearly to do with money and money alone. I think that it would be a really powerful thing if it's not likely to happen anytime soon, because the people that are in power of organising these tournaments is not their agenda, but it would be a message to say, we're not going to hold it here because we don't believe that some of your viewpoints are in line with our participants. And I think that that's the key thing. It should go back to the participants, because you're not going to have an equal agreement of what is perceived to be okay and not okay across countries. Everybody is at a different stage. I think it should go back to the participants and say, what do you think? Do you want to have it here, or are you against it because of X, Y, and Z? It's a very unlikely thing to happen because the people that are kind of controlling it are doing it for different reasons. But at the end of the day, it's about the participants and the fans. So I think the question should go back to them.
Yeah, and the other, Paul, do you share those views, or you?
I've been to Qatar and tried to work with the Supreme Committee that's organising the World Cup to move it to be more inclusive. And sadly, Paul is spot on in terms of movement on that. They didn't move. They've put minor concessions that you won't face police action if you have a rainbow flag and stuff like that. Not good enough. And they have moved on some of the labour rights. They have recognised the International Labour Organization. They've got rid of the kafala system, and so on, which is really welcome stuff, because workers' rights are human rights, just as LGBT plus rights are human rights. They're important. But in terms of the upcoming World Cup, if you are going as a player, as a fan, as a manager, as a football association, as a sponsor, as a pundit, use that opportunity to press for further changes in that country, for everybody's human rights in that country. Should never have been awarded to Qatar or Russia in the first place. But if you are going to be feeling that you love your team so much that you want to go, make sure that you go and continue to press for change. Change doesn't come about in a vacuum, and the change that's happened in the experience for LGBT plus football fans in this country, the environment has changed not just because of us, but because of some of the allies amongst the mainstream. And I'd hope that there can be further pressure put on economically through sponsors and others to really push for change in a place like Qatar, because Paul's right, it is about money, sadly.
It is. Rishi, in respect to, we've spoken about things from a global competition point of view. Liverpool Football Club is one of the greatest football clubs on the planet, and I can say that as a non-Liverpool fan. So I'm an outsider here, but I've grown up on the history and the heritage of this city, having worked here for so long as well. From the perspective of the club, how would the club deal if you had a sponsor or you were asked to play in a pre-season match in a country where the views and the values of Liverpool Football Club were not held? Do you think the club is now in a position, because it has been so successful, because it does have a global voice, to actually articulate that by saying we've been asked this opportunity, and now, given the circumstances, we don't feel it's appropriate to do that?
To be honest, that's such a difficult question to answer, because I suppose we wouldn't know unless we were presented with that opportunity. So Paul Amann talked about his experiences. It was before my time working at the club, where he went out to Qatar ahead of the Club World Cup, and I think all where I'd like us to be is an organisation where, if we are to be involved in those tournaments or those competitions which are in particular locations around the world, that we continue to stay true to our values. So how do we make sure that we represent, whether it's on the pitch, off the pitch, what the values of Liverpool Football Club are, and be true to them? So you've seen that with, you talked about Tom Daley, you've seen that with Lewis Hamilton, you've seen that with many other sports where people have stuck the proverbial two fingers up and go, no, these are my views, I am LGBT plus inclusive, I'm all for equal rights, etc. I'd like to think that's where we ended up, but that is a really tough question. To be honest, is a decision by committee as well. There are a lot of stakeholders. Paul Williams mentioned about that being down to the participants, and whilst I do partly agree with that, I also think there's a lot of responsibility upon clubs, organisers, decision makers to maybe take that out of the hands of the participants, so they're not the ones who have to make that call on behalf of everyone else. Should very much be the football collective. But that being said, that's not to cause a debate with Paul at all. Definitely agree with that point, but I think there's a little bit more to it, in my opinion.
I kind of see what you're saying, Rishi. Like, the stakeholders that are in charge of these decisions have a different agenda. So therefore, they're not likely to go back to the participants involved and the fans, are they? And I see what you're saying. I see it should be taken out of their hands. They're not likely. I mean, like, for example, like, take some examples, completely different point, like Spirits of Shankly, where they've kind of like questioned decisions that the owners of Liverpool Football Club have made, because it gets made, the decision gets made that way round, doesn't it? So the people at the top of the tree, the stakeholders, they make the decision, and then they worry about the fans and the participants afterwards, rather than doing it the other way round, I suppose would be my point.
Okay.
Joe and Ted, I think you want to contribute to this question as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things there. Yeah, firstly, I think just in terms of Liverpool, because they did experience that, and they're contractually obliged to play in the FIFA World Cup final. That's what happens as part of the World Club final. Sorry. However, they were open to discussions. So in terms of discussions with the Supreme Committee, they made it clear, like Paul and I and others made clear, that there were certain things that had to be done. Some of those were small, some of those were large. I think one of the big pieces of work that Liverpool did was that they didn't stay in the hotel that FIFA had set aside for them. They moved hotel because the number of migrant worker deaths at the hotel that they're being allocated was far too high. Now, I think that's a significant move, and actually messed with their arrangements because they were staying 25 miles out from where they were, and it did mess around. So I think that's the strength of having that viewpoint. But of course, that's a viewpoint that we as a team get to the final. We need that further back, don't we? So we need it as when the organisers think it's a great idea to be in Qatar or Saudi Arabia or wherever else it might be. The stakeholders need to be saying no then, because it's too late to make those changes further down the line. And actually, it does it then. If it wasn't Liverpool with its value base and it was another club who didn't have the same values, do they just accept it and say, well, it's okay to play in Qatar? It's okay to play in Qatar because it's financially driven, it's contract led, and actually it's our job to go and do it. So I think we've got to make sure that when the decisions are taken, that the voices of those specific stakeholders are made there and then to affect the decision, not to accept the decision.
I agree with you absolutely in principle. I think the problem is that for a mafiosa organisation such as FIFA, trying to get FIFA to do the right thing is a challenge. But Ted, you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, just on that last one there from Joe. Look at UEFA over European Cup final, St. Petersburg. That decision should have already been made. That will be relocated. The fact that the ballyhoo around it tells you everything you need to know about the likes of UEFA and FIFA and where their values lie. The simple answer to the question, Kieran, is should these countries be entitled to all the Olympics, big football tournaments? The simple answer is no, because if they're not an inclusive society, why should they be looking to welcome and include people from all around the world? It's just an absolute no-no. And Paul mentions Qatar. We're having issues. I'm in communication with the Supreme Council myself, Supreme Committee at the moment. They've tried to make Qatar inclusive. Yeah, they've got a metro station coming to a stadium, and you've got near enough a mile walk uphill to that football stadium, making it totally inaccessible to disabled supporters, and they're not going to do anything to fulfill the requirements of making it accessible. It's right across the board, really. And if these things aren't in place, or with a promise of that they will be in place by the time of the games, and in terms of inclusivity and representing the rights of LGBT community, and there's no way in a million years it's going to happen, they should not be awarded it in the first place. And it really is, whether we know money's involved, we know everything's involved, but come on, it's a simple human right that everyone should be able to go anywhere without fear or favour, watching Olympic Games or football tournaments. And if that country isn't inclusive, they shouldn't get it. It really is as simple and straightforward as that, in my opinion.
Yep. Thank you very much, panel. I think we've been through sort of some of the key questions which we had listed. I'm conscious that we've got questions from the people in the audience. Darren, have you been collating those? Are you in?
I have. So some of them might be coming back to some of the topics we've already covered, but there was one just then by Susie O'Connor, who was asking about how to engage with basic youth football, and how does football create a supportive culture for young LGBT people to come through into the sport, because obviously we can talk about senior footballers coming out, but actually if there's no pipeline for them to even get that far, what can actually be done about that?
Okay, do anyone like to, perhaps Joe, from a women's game point of view, do you think that there is that opportunity for young women in the LGBT community to come through? Are the barriers as significant as they are in the men's game?
Personally, I don't think so. I've not seen the barriers. As they've not been there as predominantly as what I've seen in the men's game. I think the fact, like we mentioned before, that we have got people within the LGBT community amongst the players in the women's game. We have a lot of kids coming to the women's game to watch, and it's just kind of the norm within the women's game for me. You've got the likes of the LFC Foundation, who do a lot of football a lot of football sessions for kids. And I think the fact that you've got those role models within the women's game makes that big difference for the kids coming through, for the young girls coming through the foundation. Whether there's anything that could change in the men's game, I don't know. Whether someone else has got a better idea than what I would on the men's side. But I think, as we mentioned again earlier, I think there's probably some things that the men's side can learn from the women's side of that. Will we see it in the next couple of years? Who knows?
Okay. And if I put this open to the Pauls as well, if you were a young gay male, how would you feel about the dressing room environment as you were coming through the academies? Do you think actually that would create such an environment where you would feel it was impossible to progress?
Sadly, Kieran, I don't think I'm good enough to talk about that level of football, but we'll talk about it at kind of a grassroots level from our club at Mersey Marauders. Myself and other players will tell you often that period after, say, playing at school, college, university is often where they become disengaged, because they might go into the grassroots environment and it might be a culture that they don't see as accepting to them due to their sexuality. So we get the question a lot, like, why do we exist? Like, why should you have a team that's just kind of, classed as for a gay football supporters network? Well, the reason is because that's a place where people can play and they can feel comfortable. What we can do as a vehicle to that is, because we have allies, do you know what I mean, that come and play with us, then we can turn around the culture in that. And then sometimes we have players that go off and feel comfortable playing for other teams afterwards. So yeah, it's definitely from a football academy point of view, I'd imagine it would be the same, but that's definitely the case at grassroots level. But I do think that that's getting a little bit better. So I sit on the IAG at Liverpool County FA, and they are trying to make a little bit of a sea change there, make it more inclusive, make sure that the member clubs sign up to the equality standards. It's difficult because they're just, again, I think that Liverpool County FA is one of the better ones at doing it. But then when you have a look at maybe the FA as a whole, there's some issues there where you have incidences where there's maybe been homophobia in games, and players and teams haven't been penalised for it, and it's gone underreported and things like that. So again, you can get to a certain level with it, but it has to come from the top down sometimes to be supportive.
Yep. And echo what Paul said. When I was playing at school, it switched me off football entirely. I returned to football because I still followed Liverpool as a football club, but then also when I moved back to Liverpool, I got shanghaied into Mersey Marauders and enjoyed playing football for the very first time in decades. It was absolutely a unique opportunity for me to play alongside other LGBT plus people in an environment where that was never going to become an issue. I know Joe Block's going to leave us right now. Just wanted to say a huge thank you to him and Spirit of Shankly for everything that he and they have done over the years and continue to do. Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks all. Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to participate in such an inspirational piece. And let's hope it's the start of a legacy and not just a one-off event. Thank you.
Okay, have we got the next question? I've got one here from Nick Bullin. Shall I shout that one out, Darren?
Yep.
Okay. Nick said, "I'd be interesting to hear if the panel think of football as an institutionally transphobic space. To me, football is inherently transphobic and isn't welcoming of gender non-conforming people, either fans or players. Having men's and women's football leaves no space for non-binary people, and trans people who identify as men or women are often alienated too." How would the panel
I can
like to react to that?
start on that one. So Nick's made a really good point, actually. Earlier, I said about the collective we can all do more, and I think that question, that's the only real way you can answer that. That's a great indicator of how much football and how far football and society has to go when it comes to inclusion. We talk about the men's game, we talk about the women's game, but Nick's right, there is a population who wouldn't feel comfortable associating with either one of those, and on the pitch, off the pitch, etc. That's something collective that we all need to do. And to be honest, I know Nick anyway. I'm due to see you next week, so I'm sure this conversation will continue. But it's only working with colleagues on this screen, the likes of Stonewall, other organisations, where we can start to progress for that and push for that change. And I think Ted mentioned a really important word there earlier around education. It's got to be an education piece where our key stakeholders, myself, our colleagues, our supporters, we all hold our hands up and be like, right, how are we going to take the next step? How are we going to be more inclusive, and actually how are we going to break down those barriers? Because unfortunately, those barriers they're still there for a lot of different groups from a lot of different communities.
Yeah. Would anybody else like to comment on that?
I remember when I was chair of Mersey Marauders, we did set it out to be as inclusive as possible from a grassroots perspective. And I know that Paul and others have continued that. And the GFSN League, etc., is much more inclusive than any other footballing environment. But when they come up against county FAs, I know that has been a real issue. So I don't know if you want to give the latest position, Paul.
Yeah, that is the issue. So we provide an example where it is inclusive, and even within the GFSN, there are better examples than others at doing it, because it is about finding a space for everybody, isn't it? And when you kind of have that it's a men's or it's a woman's game at that level, then it's difficult. And we're so far behind on that, really. That is like, I really feel for people in that situation, because I've encountered people who just haven't found a home in either setting, basically, and that must be so difficult. And it is incumbent on organisations, football clubs, county FAs, organisations like ourselves to find a home for all people.
That's great. And all I can say is, as somebody that's grown up in Brighton, we've got trans fans who come to matches, and I'll be honest, the initial reaction when we started to welcome them to the Amex, I think that there was a degree of suspicion, but then I think you prove yourself, you support the club, and then you realise that actually we're all one in terms of the love from the club. And when I sit quite close to a trans fan, and I can assure you, when that trans fan is screaming certain things about Mike Dean, which you can probably guess, he's one of us. Or, it's and that is that sense of we are all together, but it is a real challenge. Ted, do you want to contribute? I think you're on mute, Ted.
Yeah, something you mentioned there, just to pick up on, Kieran, won't it be amazing and wonderful when the day comes where we don't have to be trans fans, we don't have to be disabled fans, or we don't have to be LGBT fans, we can just be fans. And I think that's got to be the collective goal of all of us. Through unity, we'll bring strength. And we've just got to get to the stage where we're just fans. We have a saying in Liverpool, there's no such thing as a stranger. It's just a friend you haven't met yet. Or maybe we have to do that about, fans, football fans of all our different groups, just come together and just be fans. And we'll only do that through a couple of things: education, patience, tolerance, and understanding. Let's all work on that, get that message out there, and then we truly will just be fans of Brighton, of Liverpool, Manchester United, of whoever, and let's just all look out for each other.
Okay, well, Manchester United, I'm not so certain, Ted. I think might have to hold you to that. I think we've got a disagreement coming from the audience here, so I think we should perhaps discuss that. One of the people attending, it says, I disagree with the panel. football doesn't represent society, in my view. It represents a small part of society that we hope we'd left behind a few years ago. The chants, comments, abuse, etc., we don't see that in other laddish environments, such as on construction sites. Football has its unique challenges that needs to be addressed. Now, could that be due to the demographic of people at football matches? How do the panel, what's your observations with regards to that comment?
I disagree, and I think it is totally reflective of society. There's so much hate in society at the moment. You know, you don't have to pick up a paper to see that. Look online. I think it's truly reflective of society, and sad to say, I don't think it's a minority either. I just think it is reflective of society, in my humble opinion, and and I respect everyone's opinions on it.
I agree with Ted. Here. There was barely a week went by at one point last summer when there wasn't some young LGBT plus kid ended up battered, bruised and bleeding on our streets. To think that is anyway better or different than the abusive nature of some football situations, whether online or in stadia, I think it's wishful thinking to think that wider society has improved that much. Yes, we've had some improvements, but there's still a way to go on so many places.
I agree with Paul and Ted on this. The only thing that I would say, you could potentially argue that some people might use sports and other things as a vehicle to get their message across, whatever it might be, and sometimes in a negative way, and sometimes use that as a way of coming together, which can happen. So we've seen in the past, like where there might have been, hopefully it's like violence in football, for example. You'll get people that will come together and use football as the vehicle for that. Joe
Goodall, would you like to contribute on this one? What's your perspective of this?
I agree. I think I agree with Paul and Ted. There's still definitely a long way to go. Whether it's homophobic or whether it's even just derogatory comments in the women's game that we get a lot of. There's not much more I can say. I think there's just we need to all stand together and try and educate people and just keep pushing for it until we get to that point where we don't have to actually have discussions like this anymore.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Right. The next question is somebody from Steve Potter. Anybody with the surname Potter, I'm going to like, of course, being a Brighton fan. And Steve's question is as follows. I assume there's more than one gay player in the whole Premier League and the EFL. Would it not be more powerful if there was a coordinated coming out of players from several different clubs? A, to share the media spotlight, and B, to prevent a single player from having to deal with abuse by supporters of every other club? Isn't it asking too much for one person to come out publicly and take the spotlight alone? That's a cracking question.
It is.
Like to contribute.
Thanks, Steve. Steve used to play with Mersey Marauders as well, so really good to hear from him, and great Liverpool fan as well. I think in theory that sounds like a lovely concept, but I think the reality is that we all come to our coming out decision at our own time, and it's got to be right for the individual rather than necessarily right for the collective in that sense. And this is one of the few times that I'd rather go with the individual rather than kind of a collective thing, which is my normal inclination. Because when you're ready to come out, you are ready. You don't want to necessarily wait and hang around. I don't think Josh Cavallo waited until he had lots of other LGBT people ready to come out in football around him. He came out because he needed to, for his own mental health and well-being, because actually staying in the closet is stressful. But there was a time before he came out that he wasn't ready to come out, and he shouldn't necessarily be pushed to come out because actually there's a whole bunch of other people coming out at this point necessarily. So the concept sounds fine, but I think as an individual basis, it's much more nuanced than that, because we all need the space to come out when we're ready to come out.
Anybody else? Okay, I think that was a fantastic answer, Paul. So I think you probably spoke for us all. This question is from Caris Bentley. How important is it for football fans to call out their friends or people they go to football with when they make homophobic or transphobic comments or chants in relation to anyone or anything? How do we support them in being comfortable in calling out?
Through unity, through support, through having allowed the voice, to explaining that it's wrong. And that's, Kieran, that's how you do it. You support them, you make them think. Don't let them think they are a lone voice and calling it out. And that's how you do it. And then, you know, the collective will always prevail.
Yeah. And could I just bring Rishi in here? What steps is the club taking? You know, we've seen some of the stuff that took place at Ellen Road at the weekend, and look, I don't want to sanitize football. I love a match where there's an atmosphere, but I think we all know where the line is, you know, and we're all adult enough to know where that line is. Do you think the clubs are doing all that they can at present, or do you think that there are further steps that could be taken at an institutional level, on an individual club level, to prevent or look, you can't stop people from saying things, but you can certainly discourage them.
And that's it, exactly, Kieran. You can't stop these people from acting this way, but you can take action against them. Sometimes I refer to a sort of showing your teeth a little bit. Sometimes you need to show your teeth and go, actually, that's not what we are, that's not what we stand for, these aren't our values. One of the things that really encourages me at LFC is the fact that our own fans will call out poor behaviour from fellow LFC fans. That happens regularly, and that for me is a great indication of where we're currently at as a football club. That's not me saying we're perfect, far from it. We've always got more we can do, but for me that's a great indication of the culture on the terraces. So at LFC we have a reporting hub. It is essentially where people can go online, quickly fill in a form, and they can share instances of online abuse with us, or they can actually share in-stadium concerns with us. And what we found more often than not is that that's match-going LFC supporters reporting someone or something that they're not happy with from within their own, which is exactly the way it should be. It's a safe platform to allow us and our teams to go and investigate and take action against those individuals. One of the things we probably all could probably do more of in football collectively is tell that story more. Tell the world that actually this is what we've done and this is why we've done it. But that's something to work on. That's something where I'll hold my hands up. Maybe we can do a little bit more of that and say, as a football club, this individual or an individual was found to have done this, therefore this sanction has been issued against them. And I think that would definitely act as a preventative measure, but also, again, show our teeth a little bit that there are consequences to these actions.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Rishi. The next question is from an anonymous attendee, and the question is, do you think the recent coming out of Josh Cavallo from the Australian team, Adelaide United, has shown a significant step in the right direction in terms of public responses, especially from the media and fans? Anyone like to comment on that?
When I saw that happen, so I've worked in football my entire career. So when I saw that happen, it made me think that if this happened 10 years ago, would you get that worldwide recognition, show of support from the football community, from media, from other players, so visibly as well? You could argue no, because social media wasn't as prevalent as it is now, but actually when you saw football come together as it sounds really cheesy, but as a family, regardless of the club, regardless of who people followed, you saw big name footballers who were idolized across the world come out and go, good for you, Josh, backing you 110%. For me, that's an indication of real progress in the game, and that wasn't just from men's players, it was from women's players, it was from the media. The tone was absolutely perfect, and some of the biggest names in world football came out to support Josh and showed that they were 110% behind him. And for me, that made me professionally very proud to see that, especially to see some of our players do that, if I'm being totally honest. But also I was looking across other clubs, and players from Manchester United, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Arsenal put out a post. It was incredible, really, to sort of see these clubs really do that. But that's exactly the way it should be. It's exactly the way it should be. Someone feels they're ready to share, as Paul put it, much better than I ever would, but they're ready to share the true, authentic selves with the world. Hopefully Josh feels 100% supported by the football community and knows that if he ever was flying his trade over here, that he'd be more than welcome.
That's fantastic. And anybody else like to add to that? I think you've summarised it superbly there, Rishi. All right, we've got another question here from an anonymous question saying progress has been made. This is fantastic here. My 8-year-old niece now has awareness of LGBTQI+ rights, for example. Do you think that homophobia in football is generational and that it will take several generations to truly be eradicated? If my 8-year-old niece is learning about these rights and the community, why aren't adults many decades older than her being educated more? What are the barriers?
Kieran, everything's generational, isn't it? Just sometimes, I suppose the argument that we would say is that in terms of maybe football, we're maybe like a decade behind at times with things. Not the people that are trying to make the progress, but just the very fact that we don't have the representation. And there's obviously a reason why we don't have that representation. It's because people feel uncomfortable in that area. But it's just such a fantastic thing to hear, isn't it? When you have a young person like that already knowing those things. I didn't know those things when I was that age. So it is going to make a big difference. And maybe that's the exciting and positive thing, that by the time that young person gets to an age where they're 18, that maybe there will be examples of footballers that are openly out, but not even the openly out. That's not even the thing, is it? As Paul was saying before, is that isn't an issue anymore. That just isn't a relevant point.
Yeah, and as somebody that's worked in education for most of my life, it's good that we do have a curriculum which is much more progressive than where it used to be. My concern is that there's still a desire for, unfortunately, for some people to turn the clock back within the decision, who are in senior decision-making roles within society. Joe, have you got any comments with regards to this?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's still that barrier there of like a lot of older generation people still think, oh, if my child's exposed to that, they're going to turn gay, they're going to be a lesbian, and it's like it's not the case at all. I think people need that exposure. Young children need that exposure to it, to know that, you know what, it's fine if they want to be that, or if that person wants to be that. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all our own individual people. And I think it's just, if people are scared of letting younger children be exposed to that, you're always going to have problems. So I think, I think it's great. The younger that people can be educated, the better for me. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't mean that, your child's going to be this or that just because they've seen something on TV or in the media or been spoken to about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I learned about 17th century history at A level. It didn't make me want to bring back witchcraft. So, learning about something, it increases your knowledge, increases your understanding. That's the purpose of education. It's not there to change people. It's there to educate and to give them a broader perspective. I agree with you entirely. Anybody else like to add to that, or do we want to move on to the next one?
Yeah, just about kids. It's great. It's refreshing, and it's also lovely to an 8-year-old getting taught that so young, because kids are the future, aren't they? As the kids get older, if we educate them properly, to make them more tolerant and understanding of everybody, well, everything will change with it, including football. The demographic of a football club's fan base will eventually change. And the older voices will, you know, eventually get drowned out by the younger voices. So, you know, the quicker and the faster we can educate them, hopefully through all, you know, years of school, primary, junior, senior, if that's what it's still called, I don't know. Just 40-year juniors and 50-year seniors. When I went to school, that's how old I am. But, you know, education is key. Let's educate the youth, and they will bring about change. I have no doubt of that.
Great stuff. Right, next question. We've got time for a couple more. Any views on toxic masculinity? The notion that boys, particularly, are pushed into sports like football and rugby. These were the only sports offered when I was at school in the 80s and 90s. I wasn't taught how to play either sports. You were just expected to know. Do you think curriculums are improving? I mean, this is more of an education question, I think, than anything else. But any views from the panel?
I volunteer in schools occasionally and go in to talk about diversity and stuff, which is fantastic. But it's very clear that some of the attitudes of some young people, even in the same class, some may be very inclusive, very respectful, and others won't be. And I wouldn't push it back so much at the schools as families. And I think there's just as much of a responsibility there as ever there is in any school, classroom, etc. I don't know what the situation is like in terms of team sports and what sports young people are asked to take part in so much. I'm not of that generation, but you know, I think that things have generally improved in terms of most teachers now want to make sure that young people are happy in what they're doing. And I think that's really, really important. And I know that LFC Foundation does some amazing sports work, and maybe Rishi wants to perhaps give an indication of their take on it there.
Yeah, can do. To be honest, I have to confess, I'm not an absolute expert in what Foundation do, but I'll just echo what Paul said. They do some incredible stuff. And it's not just about football anymore. I think we've very much moved away from that. It's about education, it's about employability, but really importantly, it's about sort of creating pathways for young people of all genders, of all backgrounds, and actually are the pathways into sport, the pathways into employment, are the quite simply pathways into participation. So working closely with Foundation colleagues who do some incredible stuff, especially from an inclusion perspective. And we're very much and confidently say that it is fully inclusive. I think of an example of what they did for Rainbow Laces, obviously supporting Stonewall's campaign. I think they ran about 40 educational workshops across the city region as part of that campaign, whilst we had the overarching campaign piece with Jurgen and Michaela Moore running from a club level. They were doing that on a more local sort of boots on the ground level. It was absolutely fantastic to see them back up that message, but also us work really closely in tandem and push out the same message.
Brilliant. Okay, right. I think we've got time for one more question, and this is from Adele B. Thank you, Adele. Hi, panel. Is self-policing amongst fans working in terms of general acceptance, and also when the line is crossed in terms of unacceptable behaviour? Where are we at present on the terraces?
So I think, to be honest, I feel like I answered as well as I can on that one earlier around the stuff that we're doing as a club and the encouragement, but I'd be keen to hear from the fellow supporters and others on the call to see what they actually think, because I'm going to talk about it from a club perspective, but I'd be keen to see what their experiences are on the terraces, perhaps.
I mean, I go to the match as often as I can, and I've seen fan behaviour improve in general. I think there's still a way to go, but I would absolutely support self-policing first in terms of fans feeling confident to challenge inappropriate behaviour in the first instance. And if they're not making any headway, that's the point at which we go to, we support fans to access reporting mechanisms and take whatever action is going to be taken. But I don't really want that to be the first point of call. I want really fans to educate themselves amongst themselves because hopefully my experience has always been that if you get that peer pressure right, then things improve much more solidly, and there's less pushback that they're being told what to do by some authority figure, but it's actually their fellow fans.
Yeah. I go to home games regularly, and I think what we were saying before about football reflecting society remains the case in the ground. I might sit in most areas of Anfield and I feel fine, I feel safe, I don't hear any discrimination, it's great, I have a great time, and I've got friends who do the same. But yeah, there have been times where I've been in maybe one area of a game, maybe an away game or another part of the Kop, for example, and I've not felt as comfortable, not to do with always to do with sexuality, but it could be anything. And that is just reflective of society and where you are. And it's very hard to police. You can't police all of that all the time. That, you know, football can do a great job in promoting inclusivity, being well-mannered, all those kind of things, but it can't change society. You've got to, you've got to draw a line at what football can do, really, because it is reflective of society, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I agree with that, Paul. There will always have to be an element of self-policing, because there will always be one idiot. There will, whether it's just an idiot in general or an idiot through alcohol or what have you. We're very fortunate at Liverpool Football Club that, you know, they nip anything like this right in the bud, and it is usually through education. After the Chelsea thing, I know Rishi was very active about it, as was Paul. But I've been going to Anfield for 51 years, you know, and I've seen it all in terms of chanting, you know, right at the very beginning to where we are now. And I have two daughters in the early 20s who now go. From what I hear from them when they come back from the away games of things they have challenged, whether it be homophobia or racism, by what I'm hearing from them, I am already seeing the early seedlings of change. And I think our football club has a lot to do with that, in the way they are getting the message out there. So I think, you know, self-policing will have to stay. We'll have to stay for the duration. But I am definitely seeing the seeds of change as a football supporter who's been going for, you know, longer than I care, you know, to admit. But it's definitely changing, and long may it continue.
Thanks very much, Ted. Right, I think that's all the questions, which is almost perfect timing, and I'd like to claim that this was down to our knowing exactly what was going to happen in advance. But let's be honest, it was more luck than judgment, certainly from my contributions. I'd just like to say, would you like to have any concluding remarks from the panel? Could we start off with you, Joe?
I think what's been said, you know, this afternoon has been great. I think, you know, one of the main points to take away from it is, you know, that everyone can be educated more, even us to an extent. And it is just a case of trying to be that more inclusive, trying to, you know, build allies and just trying to push that inclusivity within and across the game.
Paul Williams.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to take part in this conversation, and I think that that's the key thing: to keep having the conversations, keep looking at the way that we can improve things. We can always do better, as with anything, any walk of life with things, but we're making progress, and let's keep doing what we're doing. Great.
Ted, over to you.
Yeah, I feel very privileged that I was given the opportunity to take part in this discussion. LGBT plus will always have our support, and, you know, we will always stand shoulder to shoulder with Paul and Kop Outs, and that's a fact.
Brilliant. Rishi, from the club.
I think, to be honest, definitely echo the sentiments, everything that's been said already, but from a club perspective, I think I'm personally, professionally, really proud to stand side by side with colleagues on the call and many other colleagues internally, on the pitch, off the pitch, in the fight against discrimination, whether that's as we challenge big chunky issues, or actually as we makes really small changes for people but have a huge impact. And our belief around this being a key part of everything that we do and embedding it in everything that we do is unwavering. So there'll always be more to come from LFC.
And Paul Amann.
I just really want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's taken the time today, both on the panel and in the audience, to listen, to think of proper responses to some of the quite intriguing questions sometimes. And a huge thanks to not only the university for setting this event up, but also to yourself, Kieran, and every panel member who has consistently shown real allyship and support to people in the LGBT plus community in our city and our city region. Massive thanks, and keep on showing that solidarity, keep on really giving a damn, because it does make a huge difference to people.
Fantastic. Well, I'd just like to say on behalf of the university, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the panel. It's been an honour and a privilege for me to get to know you, to listen to your insight and expertise from all aspects of the game, and we appreciate your contribution so much.